Welcome back to Pacific SitRep. We have with us our esteemed Naval Commander Salamander, who has agreed to give us some time tonight, and we really appreciate it because I know he's very busy. Sir, I wanted to have you on because of this, which was the U.S. intel China may invade outlining Taiwanese islands to start this conflict. But there's been so much happening since then with the drones in Russia, and you've put out some really important stuff since that. But let's start with this the intel report coming out from the U.S. government about this possible way of China looking to start the conflict by taking islands and kind of stair stepping towards Taiwan.
Yeah, and thanks again for the invitation, Todd. It's always great to talk to you. And yeah, this has been going on since decades before either one of us were alive. But there's a couple of things when you look from an operational planner, and I've kind of had fun with, as a former operational planner, looking at what would I do were I Chinese. Now I have a different education, different cultural, different historical background, but one thing that kind of like their uniforms, one thing that they've adopted from the West, and I was trained as an operational planner, not so much by Americans, but by Europeans, mostly Germans. And they use the same canon. Germans read Sun Tzu, Chinese read Clausewitz. So there's a lot of overlap between the two. And so what you're looking for first and foremost is what is my higher direction and guidance in my commander's intent. And for them, it's all coming from Chairman Xi. And then in response to that, and this is what we don't know, and I think this is where the concern about the islands comes into play, is if Chairman Xi is, as he said, at the anniversary of the creation of the People's Liberation Army, I want you to be ready to take Taiwan if needed, coming up in, year and a half or so. So in response to that, because I know that Chairman Xi is not shy about firing generals and admirals when he deems fit, which, good for him. Good leaders do that to prepare their military. I'm going to do a good job. So I'm going to get my staff together, which have a lot of, great staff officers, some of whom did their undergraduate and graduate training in the U.S. and other Western nations. So they kind of know us like Yamamoto did, or they have close relatives that are here. And they're going to come together with a variety of plans. And then that's going to work the way through the system. And you have different courses of action that can go from, we always do the red and blue. You can flip the colors if you want to on that. But what's the most likely? What's the most dangerous? What is the least dangerous, depending upon your point of view? Different courses of action, depending upon what is the desires of your higher direction and guidance. We don't know the details of it. And I'm sure for many years, they've gone through this process, multiple iterations. So somewhere on the Chinese Joint Staff, they have on the shelf, not just one plan, but a series of plans.
Sure, as we do. Yeah.
Yep, as we do. And I think they go from, and you look at the Chinese experience, and a lot of people will throw a little shade on the Chinese for this. I don't. It's actually kind of smart on their part. Their military has not been engaged in many wars in the last few decades, especially in the post-Deng Xiaoping era. That has its advantages and disadvantages. But when you look at the recent Chinese experience with war, when they've initiated conflict, you have in the early days, when they still were full of revolutionary fervor, they went into and took Tibet. Very aggressive move. At the end of the recovery from the Cultural Revolution, they decided to get uppity with Vietnam just a few years after they beat the United States in the war, and Vietnam handled them pretty well. But in the very modern context, when they have wanted to reacquire what they see as their territory, what is always in the back of their mind is how they got Macau and Hong Kong back. Now, a lot of that was legalism, in that those were 99-year leases by the Portuguese and the British, and the leases are up, and those are rules-based legal orders. There were some things, especially the British, might have been able to do to make it more difficult, but that's a alternative history, no reason to go into.
Yeah.
So they got a lot of gain from Hong Kong just by being there and smiling. And I think that is a big draw for them, is how do we get Taiwan back with the least amount of damage so we can take advantage of their, um, not just the strategic position that Taiwan would give them, which is just look at a map, it's beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
but also the economic gains that they would get by
Of course.
reacquiring that territory. And if they, which if I was going to place money, I would say that Chairman Xi is probably going to have, um, a plan, pick a plan that starts as low key and as easygoing as possible, and then has branch plans at certain decisive points. When you actually do an operational plan, one of the fun things we geeky staff officers will do is you have, you know, nice little PowerPoint slide, or I like to do it by hand on a 6 foot by 8 foot whiteboard.
Mm-hmm.
You have lines of operation going from left to right on your timeline, and over on your right, you have your end states, your goals, your center of gravity, your different lines of operation, maritime, air, political, psyops, info ops, whatever. And along those lines, you have certain decisive points. We expect at D plus X from initiating of this plan, which D plus 0 does not mean missiles are flying. D plus 0 might be withdraw the ambassador for consultations. So anyway, along that line of operation, you have certain decisive points. And when you have measures of effectiveness, have we reached along this line of operation a decisive point? And if the answer is yes, you keep going along that line of operation. If the answer is no, then you have a branch plan where you go down further. And where I devising one of these plans, I would have certain branch plans attached to it, where if the nice way wasn't working, we have a branch plan. Okay, we're going to be a little more grumpy. Now, what's one of the really big pressure points you could do? Well, you go back to what is easiest to do with the least impact, and that are these smaller islands. And there's a whole series of them. You have the Kinmen and Matsu, and for you old Cold Warriors, you might have remembered Kinmen called Quemoy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Kinmen, Quemoy, however you want to call it, in the modern context, everybody calls it Kinmen, the Kinmen Islands. They're only 2.5 nautical miles from the Chinese mainland. There's some great pictures out there, and I would recommend everybody go to Google Earth or just Google it. You can get pictures. Where in the background, it's this 21st century high-rise cities that they're right there. The other islands are in the Channel, which is about 95 nautical miles wide, which, just for context, most Americans are familiar with the Normandy invasions. And if you looked at the English Channel from the Normandy beaches where we, the British and the Canadians, landed, to the Isle of Wight, right off the southern coast, it's about 80 nautical miles. So it's another 15 nautical miles distance. So that gives you the idea about what a cross-strait transit would look like. And you can look at the Pinghu, which I'm not pronouncing it right, but that's okay. The Pinghu Islands are kind of what the Channel Islands were, but they're off to the side. Not a big deal. But that would be a place where, back in the old days, there were artillery exchanges, but it'd be more than that if they were going to take those islands to try to give additional pressure, or that could be phase one. But I really think that they would exhaust all their soft power first before we would start to see that kinetic ability. But that being said, one reason why Quemoy, Kinmen, and Matsu are still under Taiwan control and not the PRC's control, because they just didn't have the military ability to do that. That's not true anymore.
Yeah. So what would be the U.S. response? I mean, if the CCP did that, the PLA, it would be a big red flag, like we're moving forward, right? Or would it be?
Well, again, and let's go from the Chinese Joint Staff to the American Joint Staff. They will do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
What is higher direction and guidance and commander's intent? And for them, that's the commander in chief.
Mm-hmm.
So what has and a lot of people say, well, we have treaty obligations. I shouldn't have to tell anybody. Paper is one thing, blood and iron is another.
Yeah, sure.
Nobody is like, we could spend an entire week going through scenarios of where NATO does not execute Article 5 or only part of NATO does. People forget that at the start of World War I, the Austrians and the Germans thought the Italians were going to be on their side. In the 1930s, Italy wanted to go with France and the UK to kick the Germans back out of the Rhineland. I mean, paper is paper.
Well, we're maybe about to be in a position in Eastern Europe at that exact situation where, you get some kind of escalation and Trump may say, this isn't our war. I mean, you started it. It's not our war. So anyway, back to the Pacific.
Yeah, back to we could almost do an entire show just on that.
Yeah.
A lot of NATO nations, most notably the United States, has fought lots of wars without bringing any other NATO nations in there. Nations have agency; they can do what they want to, but it's more difficult for nations that don't have the capacity. But again, back to the Pacific. What would we do? What is in our national interest as defined by the Commander-in-Chief? Is this worth going to war on? And I think well-meaning people can disagree on that.
Yeah.
It all depends upon what type of future that you want and what is the next war that you want to, when do you go to war with China then if it's not going to be over Taiwan? How does that affect the Japanese calculus on how they relate to the U.S. and the People's Republic of China? You've got to be careful. But the best way to avoid that is, let's go back to the Chinese Joint Staff. The Chinese are cautious. That's why they haven't been involved in a bunch of imperial policing wars the last few years, last few decades. So they're looking at they're asking themselves, is this worth it? And part of that calculus is how much risk is there of failure, so they lose face. And that type of government, it's not like a Western democracy where if they have a vote of no confidence and you're voted out of power, then you go to your vacation condo in Spain or Miami for the rest of your life and go like there. No, you wind up with a bullet in the back of your head. So you've got to be careful. So how do you make Taiwan as unappetizing of a target as possible? And you can think militarily, like how do we make the porcupine quills sharper and longer? But I think the real thing and the biggest concern I have, it's the non-kinetic part of Taiwan. The Taiwan political elite and the Taiwanese people, are they willing to stand up for their independence under a lot of pressure? Because there's no reason why a U.S. commander-in-chief should send the American fleet and it's what few heavy bombers it has west of the international date line to defend people who aren't willing to give the last full measure to defend themselves. There's still a question mark on that too.
Well, Trump has said that, why are we defending Taiwan? I mean, he said that out in public not that far ago. So what do you think about what's going on in South Korea while we're talking about all the Korean people? Have they lost the will to defend themselves?
I don't think so. I think what you have in South Korea, and South Korea to me is even more opaque than Japan. Is I've often described Japan, and you can put South Korea in this as well. And I've done exercises and served with Koreans and Japanese. They're Western adjacent. I think that there's a great movie with Bill Murray in it that is set in Japan. Oh, what is that? It was anyway. He's an aging actor who's over there doing ads and things like that. And I thought that captured Japan really well. Is when you look at it in a flash, it seems ultra modern, ultra Western. But when you get into it, it's like listening to a good familiar song that's 1/4 off key. Is you just kind of, this is different, and it is different. So it's hard to really get your mind out of what's going on in Korea. But I think the Koreans, they don't want North Korea. They've got enough challenges of their own.
Yeah, sure.
And matter of fact, I think they have a vested interest. And I'm not really comfortable in this area, but I do understand this particular view that the South Koreans are actively trying to make sure North Korea doesn't fall apart because they don't want to have to deal with the recovery like West
Right.
Germany had to do with East Germany. Because another thing that Korea has to worry about, and it's a developing science in our era because we as a species um, have never had to deal with such a situation that we're going to be experiencing. Korea and Japan will be a couple of the first, in China as well, East Asia as a whole. That's a demographic collapse. Korea is going to almost not exist in 100 years simply because they're not having enough. It's
Well, you
not
saw
that
Japan lost 1 million people last year in
yep.
their population. It's
And the
shocking.
South Korean collapse is even greater. And both of those cultures are such that even if there was a way to acculturate people from other parts of the world into being Japanese, you're not going to turn 1 million Nigerians into Koreans or Japanese. You're just not going to, it's just not going to take place.
No.
So from a national security point of view, I don't think the world really has wrapped their head around, and I use this data point before somebody else. And when I say, when you look towards 2040, a lot of people, especially those in their 30s or something, will blink their eyes and go, wow, that's way off in the future.
This is a special report.
Knowing how to invest your money is harder than ever before. Dealing with stock market volatility, record debt, and terrorist attacks requires new thinking. At U.S. Asset Management, we can help you see the world more clearly so that you can move beyond the chaos and invest with confidence. Call us, visit us online, or drop by our office. U.S. Asset Management, helping you make better decisions with your money.
We recommend you take this moment to do what we're about to do, which is enjoy an Alp.
Your government doesn't care about you. That's why you need a medical emergency kit. It contains life-saving medications like ivermectin, Z-Pak, and antibiotics. Stock them before they block them.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's not. It's just 15 years away.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a young strapping man there, Todd. Just like me, we're both still kids. Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I remember 2010 really well.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that-
No.
and that's the distance between now and then. But when you get to mid-century, and I'd encourage people, again, all you got to do is Google it. Look at demographics. Look how many millions are in the Chinese point of view. Hundreds of millions of people less that they will have. How do you build an army? How do you fight a war? And this is one,
Robots.
yeah, and this is one thing that I'm still trying to figure out. But again, it has to do, you look at Russians and Ukrainians,
Mm-hmm.
and you go, well, they look like most Americans, so I guess they think like us. No, they're different. But how do you look at mom and pop in Kiev or in St. Petersburg and say your son needs to give his life for the fatherland when they don't have a backup son? They have one kid,
Yeah.
and that one kid is going to be thrown out in a meat attack just like his cousin was. So you can have, in just the way the demographics are, last time I looked, I think Russia has 1.4 or 1.6 children
Replacement rate.
per
Yeah.
women, and the Ukrainians are even less. Now, you can have a situation where you and your brother both have one kid, and that's it, and they've died in the war. So your entire
Well,
line
that's
is
already
done.
happened in Ukraine. I mean, it's been depopulated. There's, less than 25 million people there. It used to be 45-ish, 42-ish just a couple years ago. I mean, a lot of them have left, and they're not coming back. I'll tell you that. Well, some want to come back, but a lot don't. And I think Ukraine is, as a civilization, it's going to be the first African nation in Europe, because that's what they want to do. They want to bring in a lot of immigrants, and maybe Western Ukraine survives over towards Lviv, and that becomes kind of a rump state. But Ukraine as a nation, I don't think is going to look the same as it did 2 or 3 years ago.
And there's a lot more historical and what used to be called Galicia
Yes, exactly.
back in
Yeah.
the Austro-Hungarian War. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that is the Ukrainian heartland. What happens in the rest? We'll find out, but it's ugly, and China's going to have something very similar. I'm sure you've seen it as well.
Mhm.
The ghost cities in China, where they've
Yes.
built for hundreds of thousands of people,
Yeah.
and there's nobody there. And a lot
Yeah.
of people say, "Well, this was a jobs program." I, I have a different theory, and I'm not the only person to come up with it.
Mhm.
Uh, Communist bureaucracies, and we could be guilty of this in places as well, like nothing more than giving good news to their boss and lying. There's a reason why Potemkin Village
Mhm.
is a verbal meme. I just think that in a centrally planned economy, somebody told them, in this province, we are going to have X number of young families that need housing. Okay, well, we need to build housing for X. Well, actually, they had 0.7X.
Yeah.
So they've built 0.3X extra. And because they're not going to let people make free decisions, they go, okay, we're going to mark off this 0.3 area for development and wait for the people to show up. They're not showing up because they're never born.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's what I think is going on there. So how much is the average Han Chinese family willing to accept, from a sacrifice point of view, to take back a nation of 21 million known as Taiwan? However, just like I mentioned with the Russians and the Ukrainians, this is bold-faced, underlined. Never underappreciate the cultural ability of the Chinese people to accept pain, misery, and destruction and keep
Oh,
going.
same with the Russians. I mean,
Very resilient people.
yeah. Yeah. I agree. I wanted to bring up, you put out something, and with your permission, we reprinted it at armedforces.press.
Sure.
Ukrainian drones are tapping us on the shoulder. Was
Yep.
that yours? Yeah, I think it was.
Yep.
With and I was struck by the boats lined up there, the ships, I should say. I'm not a Navy guy, but
Submarines or boats. If they're not submarines, you have to call them ships, or people get grumpy.
okay. So that looks a lot like the Bear bombers lined up on the Siberian runway
Yep.
for drones to come through. What say you? I mean, you can find this on armedforces.press for our audience, but what are you trying to get across there?
Well, and what's really scary here
Mhm.
is this is looking west to north. Let me make sure I'm getting this right. No, this is we're south. This is looking south,
Mhm.
and you have the James River off to the right. So because these piers go roughly north south.
Mhm.
Now, if you were looking at this, if you turned around, you would see off to your right the Chesapeake Bay Bridge,
Mhm.
and you have the James River. You have these huge merchant ships going back and forth and back and forth and back, even back to when Reagan was president, and I was a midshipman. And I've been spending quality time in Norfolk since the mid '80s. It's actually a great town. Especially now, it's much better now than it was in the 1980s. But we used to joke all the time, what happens if somebody loses steerage and they come into these ships going, you got a big tanker doing
Mhm.
15 knots, they can take out 3 or 4 aircraft carriers.
Mhm.
And it's really scary on the holiday season because everybody wants to be home for the holidays. So
Right.
you can, like this picture, this is actually from 2012, but this could have been from any other year, where you have a large portion of our capital ships that are all lined up there, neat as can be. And you see the little floats in the water off there. Some people think that's to contain spills and stuff, and there are other things for that, but that's supposed to protect the ships,
Mhm.
because the force protection thinking is like, when was the last time we got hit real hard? Well, that was the USS Cole before 9/11. So a
Yeah.
quarter century ago. And that was a Zodiac filled with explosives. Okay, so we need to protect from that. Yes, that's true. But ah, you know,
The
it's
enemy is much more creative now.
it is. And
Mhm.
Norfolk's a big city. It has the Chesapeake Bay is full of ships. And in the modern context, we need to be very serious about how we protect our ships from the modern threat. And the Ukrainians have given everybody, especially us, a huge favor. I often compare it to the Spanish Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
The Spanish Civil War, it ended right before World War II. But in that, 3 years and change that war really went on, the nationalists and the Republicans and the Germans and the Italians and the Soviets, they did in miniature all the horrors that were going to be seen at the tactical level in World War II, the tanks, the area bombing, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, and so forth. It was all right there. And the Russia-Ukrainian war has been useful in that regard as well. So it doesn't have to be, though you can run this scenario out, though I think it's highly unlikely, but I might be proven wrong. I don't see the Chinese doing a bolt out of the blue to attack the US, but if they were going to, they're not going to let this opportunity go to take advantage of America's freedom of movement. One of the top 5 things that I tap my hat to the Ukrainian special forces for
Mm-hmm.
is Russia is not easy to get around in. It's
True.
just not. Even on a good day. I've only spent 2 days of my life in post-Soviet Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and that was enough. St. Petersburg was beautiful, but if I had one more musky-looking policeman, that was enough for me.
Mm-hmm.
So the U.S. is much different than that. And Norfolk is a huge place. The Chesapeake Bay is a huge place. There's all sorts of interesting places you can hide things, and you don't have to sink a ship.
Yeah.
You just have to make it, not mission capable. And with modern, a lot of people may remember from the Iraqi conflict, especially, though we saw them in Afghanistan as well. The quote primitive unquote shape charge warheads, which is basically an inverse cone of copper that when exploded turns into a stream of molten metal that can burn its way through a tank. You get a shaped charge sitting on top of an aircraft carrier that's dropped by or placed by a drone and goes click boom. How far
down does it go?
How far down is that stream of hot metal going to go to? How much JP5 is it going to hit? How close does it get near the reactor? Now, if we even have partial damage to anything involving a reactor on one of our aircraft carriers, because they're nuclear powered, even if there's no leak, you and I both know the reaction to that is going to shut things down for a long time.
Yeah,
So,
economic collapse. I mean, that's or an economic wound, I
so
should say.
if your operational plan is, Chairman,
Mm-hmm.
if we can keep the American Navy, at least half of it, out of our hair for 9 months, we'll achieve your objectives.
Yeah.
And that's one way you can do it. You don't have to sink it. You just have to take it out of action for 9 months. However, this is probably why I would get kicked out of the Chinese staff, because I'm the however guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote about this over 3 years ago, just a little bit after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 22. It's clear to me that Putin was poorly served by his joint staff. He was given a brief of what would happen through a whole series of what I describe as optimism filters.
Mm-hmm.
So he was told this was going to be a 3-week or a 3-month war.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't been. So that is something that.
Yep, that's a good point.
In America has a habit of underestimating itself and others underestimate it. The U.S. Civil War was supposed to be over after the first Battle of Manassas.
Mm-hmm.
The Japanese thought that after they spanked us in Pearl Harbor, we'd tuck our tail in and go home. That's not our national character. Our national character, we're a bunch of people who either were kicked out of, ran away from, survived genocide and slavery, and came to the North American continent. We're a strange mix of people. We don't quit too easily in major conflicts.
Well, I hope we still have that. We will see, but I'm worried about that. Although I do see a lot of sparks of 1,000 points of light in the younger generations, I should say, that is encouraging.
I share your concerns.
I have one more question. Black Sea. What is the U.S. doing in the Black Sea?
Well, I think our largest goal is to ensure that the grain keeps flowing. But I think it's also clear, because everybody went into high warble over it. I think it was it February or March that they kind of spoke out of turn and said, how dare the U.S. stop giving intel information to the Ukrainians? Oh, which answered the question, is the U.S. giving intel to the Ukrainians? Well, if you're complaining that they're not doing it now, you've just answered the question. So in order to do that, you need a presence. And it was also pretty clear early on in the war. I'm sure everybody had seen the maps, though you don't see it much anymore for obvious reasons. It had all of the U.S. and NATO reconnaissance assets and what their flight paths were through the Baltics, through Poland, in the Black Sea itself. We never actually went over Ukraine, but you don't have to when you're at 33,000 feet. So that's what we're doing, is helping to ensure the grain keeps moving. And also, if we're giving them intel, we have to have a way to get it to them. That's one way to do it. Is that what you were looking for?
Well, yeah, I think I just it seems to me NATO wants to have, that's been a Russian lake for some time, and at least it's been said to be. I think NATO wants a much bigger presence there, and I don't know if the U.S. is on board with that or not. I mean, obviously the blob is, but I'm not sure the Trump administration is. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that and Elbridge Colby, who for a long time before he had his present position, if people wonder, what is driving a lot of the conversation in the U.S. towards Europe versus Asia, go read Elbridge Colby. He's got stuff out there for years. There is a desire to try to disengage as much as you can there, generally speaking, because they believe rightfully that the big area for concern is in the Pacific, and the more resources that we have in Europe, the fewer we're going to be able to send over there. For instance, the one thing that delayed the uplift of, I'll just use a perfect example. You only have so much. I'll use one platform. You only have so much reconnaissance assets, so many reconnaissance drones, the predators that people are used to, and there's a whole series of them. The uplift of forces that we had in the end of the 00s in Afghanistan, some people called it the Obama surge. It wasn't the Obama surge. The planning for it began in 2007. The forces actually started to flow there the summer of 2008. Just Obama's team in the winter and early spring looked over the plan, changed happy to glad, and put their signature on it and said, you can keep doing it, but it was already underway. But one thing that delayed that from going earlier is, if you recall, we had to make sure that the conditions on the ground in Iraq were such that we felt comfortable moving assets off the primary fight in Iraq and forces out of Iraq into Afghanistan to facilitate the uplift of forces, along with our allies that are sending people in there. It's the same thing here, is we only have so many assets, so much money, so much people, so much intellectual capital to invest in somewhere. And if we need to invest that in the Pacific, we need to calm things down and get it successful in Europe. I think that's part of the reason why that you've heard a lot from SecDef, Hegseth, and others. Hey, NATO, that's great that you're hitting 2%, but you need to look at 5%. We're going to be here. We're going to be here to back you up, but you have to take primary control for your own defense so we can go elsewhere.
Well, I happen to think the Ukraine conflict was, a Manchurian Biden putting our forces in that war to take it out of the Pacific. I think that was a big, grand op, in my opinion. But we could talk about that all night. Is there anything else you would think people need to know, Commander?
One thing that I've noticed recently that I would encourage everybody to do, I've interviewed him before, Ray Powell. He focuses a lot specifically on the Philippines versus China. And I was teasing him earlier this week. I was like, I can always tell when you've pissed off the Chinese, because all of their bots and trolls come after you.
Yeah.
But there are, and this sounds like a cliche, but I encourage everybody to read broadly. Don't just read inside your lane. Read people that you don't agree with. Read people you do agree with in between, but be careful what your sources are, because there's a lot of people out there that are
Have
they're not.
agendas.
Yeah, some of them are state actors. Others are people just have agenda. Some of them are just they like to make stuff up. So just
Yep.
be careful. But there is the summer fighting season is happening in Ukraine,
Mhm.
and there's advantage to Russia on that. Also, Russia is not going to take losing between 20 and 40 of their literally irreplaceable heavy bombers without an obscene response, or a expected response, depending upon your point of view.
Mhm.
And in the Pacific, the game is afoot. Read broadly, but read carefully. And next time we can talk, maybe we'll have some things. But I don't think we're going to see a bolt out of the blue.
Yeah.
But there's going to be indications and warnings, and we're already having some of those.
So,
As
well, go ahead.
no, and specifically when you look at the amount of flight hours the People's Republic of China is doing around Taiwan, and the
Mhm.
number of ships they have underway around Taiwan, that continues to grow. As long as that continues to grow, then maybe that course of it, that low boil course of action, they might be refining it and getting ready. So the game is afoot. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but people need to pay attention.
How do people follow you, Commander?
I'm over on Substack,
Mhm.
cdrsalamander.substack.com. Mark Tempest and I have been doing our little podcast Mid-Rat since
Mhm.
2010. They can find us there, and of course I'm on X at CDR Salamander as well. And sometimes I'm there to twist people's tails. Other time I put something that might be interesting.
Well, it's very informative. I've found that, and we will print some of it on AFP. So thanks for that, and we'll see you next time, sir. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Todd.
Okay, take care.